So welcome to another practical demonstration of staining techniques. This time we'll be comparing two types of Elastin stain, Orcein and the Verhoeff's hematoxylin technique. So we've already prepared some sections of oesophagus, and the sections to be stained with Verhoeff, so just sitting here in the water bath, just adjust the water level there a little bit. The Orcein, however, the slides only need to be taken down as far as 70% alcohol because the Orcein stain is effectively in a fairly alcoholic solution, so that's as far as we need to go. Whereas the Verhoeffs, we've taken them all the way down to tap water. Okay, so now it's useful to compare these two staining techniques side by side just to better illustrate the similarities and differences. Beginning with similarities, you'll notice we've got 4 petri dishes here, and that's because it's advantageous to stain all of these slides upside down just to prevent any precipitate falling onto the surface of the slide, given that they're fairly alcoholic solutions. So we can see here, you just invert the slide. This is the Orcein going on first to these two slides, and we'll leave that on for 60 minutes. So just ejecting the stain between the slide and the petri dish with one end of the slide raised, similar to how we stain with the Weigert's hematoxylin when doing trichromes. Okay, so we'll start that first just because it is the longer of the two incubations, so it's always good practice to get things that take longer, start those first, so that then we can do other things in between. Okay, so just check the watch there, just to keep track. Of course, it doesn't need to be accurate to the nearest minute. Give or take 5 or 10 minutes would probably still work fine, but approximately 1 hour for the Orcein is generally the standard method. So now the Verhoeff's hematoxylin solution does need to be prepared fresh from these 3 solutions, the A, B and C. 2.5 mils of the alcoholic hematoxylin combined with 1 mil of per 2.5 mils for the ferric chloride, and then finally 1 part of the Lugol's iodine. So I'm just mixing these up here in no particular order, just adding them all to the hematoxylin. I think that's going to work fine. I'll just transfer it over to here just to get a better idea of the colour there. So it's a very dark solution, in some ways quite similar to the Weigert's hematoxylin, certainly very dark, but it does need to be prepared fresh, no doubt just because of the amount of precipitation that can go on when you combine the hematoxylin with its mordant, effectively, the ferric chloride and the iodine. But of course the purpose of those two ingredients is quite complex, as we'll go on and discuss as we move forwards. So again, just shaking off as much of the excess water as possible as to not dilute the stain too much, and then once again placing the staining solution between the slide and the petri dish. Now Verhoeff's is a shorter incubation time, that's only 20 minutes. So that's certainly one advantage when comparing these two staining techniques. So approximately about the same start time, but to come off a lot earlier. So 20 minutes later, here we go, and we've finished the Verhoeff's hematoxylin. So we'll just bring those down a bit closer to the water bath. So we just simply get the water running a little bit, just a gentle stream. So we'll just rinse off the excess stain, both sides. Certainly don't get very much precipitation onto the glass, given that they're stained upside down. There's a little bit there on the back. That can be taken off with a bit of ferric chloride or a bit of acid alcohol if necessary. You can see straight away just how dark that section is on both of those slides. Because effectively, the Verhoeff's hematoxylin stains everything. But as we engage a differentiation step, we'll find that the elastin fibres will tend to hang on to more of the stain by virtue of van der Waals forces. Okay, so give that a really good rinse. Now, if you were to do microscope control at this point, you can see it's very dark. If you do any sort of microscope control, I won't show it here, but effectively it's very black. Everything is very dark. So you do need to apply a bit of ferric chloride, as shown there. So I've estimated about 15 seconds there. I'll just sort of put a little bit on there and make sure the water's all tipped off, and just holding it over the filter paper there, you can get a little bit of a sense of how the colour is bleaching a little bit. So the ferric chloride is competing. I guess you've got free mordant going on, competing to the mordant that's already there, bonding it to the tissue. So for the most part, any of the hematoxylin bounds simply by ionic interactions will tend to be let go more easily. But the literature does often talk about a bleaching effect with the ferric chloride as well. So just applying it there to the second slide. Can't quite make it out from this distance from the camera, but if you look very closely over that 15 seconds of agitation, you can really see how the areas corresponding effectively to mostly where the collagen is will start to clear visibly before your eyes. Okay, so make sure the lid's back on there. So you do need to apply at least a little bit of ferric chloride, as shown there, in order to start to be able to see where those elastin fibres are. So we'll just put that onto the microscope here and have a little bit of a look. So now the slide will start to dry out a little bit, but you can see here it's very dark. There is some glandular tissue there deep in the wall of the esophagus. A bit of skeletal muscle down the bottom is a bit yellow, most likely due to the iodine. Just hunt around to find a bit of elastin. There we go. So we've got an artery there with an internal elastic lamina. And you can see quite clearly, just get the arrow here, you can see there's that very dark outline of elastin fibre towards the middle there, the internal elastic lamina. So that's good enough. We can see what's going on, but there's really not a very good contrast between those elastin fibres and, say, the collagen and other tissue elements. So we do need to give it a little bit longer. So I'll give both of these about another 15 seconds or so, just agitation backwards and forwards. When you do enough of these stains, you tend to get a sense just macroscopically of when you are close, but it's best to not go too far. So it's a bit like differentiating hematoxylin for a H&E. Keep those steps definable and sort of reasonably brief so that you can adjust the level of differentiation that's necessary to get optimal staining. So that's looking pretty good. Just rinse off in water each time after the ferric chloride. And so now we'll be able to go back and just have to make sure they're well rinsed. Make sure that ferric chloride is totally off the slide, and then we'll go and check that staining again. Now you should notice there's a substantial decrease in background. So there we go, just putting that on there, you can see the elastin there now, at least to my eyes, that's a lot more contrasted to the paler smooth muscle next door to it. There's a little bit of colour there in the collagen, but you can also see now there's quite evident elastin fibres throughout the connective tissue itself. Again, the skeletal muscle's got a bit of a yellowy tinge, most likely the iodine. There's a way to get rid of that, we'll discuss later. See the mucus within the goblet cells there is also holding a bit of colour. Now, you might be thinking that's better to differentiate further, but in fact that's a good place to stop. If we want to remove that yellow colour, a bit of rinsing in the 90% alcohol will tend to remove that iodine. But I'm quite happy with this colour overall because we're going to apply a Van Giesen counterstain. And because the picric acid in the Van Giesen counterstain is yellow, that's just going to contribute to any of that sort of iodine, yellowy colour as well. So I'm not too concerned. We'll just prepare for the Van Giesen by giving a rinse in deionized water. And then just flick off the excess there, just so we're not diluting the stain too much. And then thanks to Chris and Jess, we've got a solutions here. This one contains the Van Giesen solution. So picric acid combined with the acid fuchsin together for 2 minutes will preferentially partition by virtue of molecular weight and tissue element porosity to preferentially stain up all the collagen, a nice pink red colour, and the background being quite yellow. So 2 minutes, that should be about right. Don't really need to write this down, but just out of habit. So after 2 minutes now, coming back to those slides. So the process here is identical for when you complete a Van Giesen. We tip off the stain, remembering not to rinse in the tap water because that will destroy the balance of staining there. We'll use the blotting paper face down, make a hinge with the index finger on the left hand in my case, thumb holding it steady, bit of light pressure across the back of the slide, being careful to create a hinge again with the index finger with the left hand and bringing up like that. Just checking to see that there's no obvious stain solution left on the slide because this is effectively the first dehydration step. That looks pretty good, so now we can go to some brief rinses in the absolute alcohol. Bit of a tap each time to drain off the excess. Now to the second absolute alcohol. Tapping again as we go through. There's no water at the top of the slide, critically, that's very important. And then straight to the xylene. And now we can turn our attention to the second. Again, the same process. Bit of a tip and a flick to get off as much of the excess as possible. Then just get another couple of sheets of filter paper here, just the Wattman number 1. And then make a hinge again, holding it firmly in place so there's no sidewards motion, otherwise you can get blotting artifact. Bit of light pressure on the back. Again, pivot with the index finger to make a hinge. Up it comes. There might just be a little bit of stain on there, I think, this time. A couple of little droplets. Can't quite see. There we go. Just get those off there. That's all good now. So effectively, that's pretty much nearly dry. You don't want to let it completely dry out, but just no noticeable liquid, free liquid on the surface. Again, some brief dips in the absolute alcohol. Remember, if you overdo the absolute alcohol, you can start to remove the picric acid. So brief dips through to the xylene, and then that's safe to leave until you're ready to transfer to the second Copland jar, and then we can go cover slip. And so here's the final results now. It's a bit bright at the lower power, but just adjusting it now to the high power here. So you see there's the elastin fibres within a relatively small artery there. We can see some bright pink collagen. Those mucous glandular structures look quite pale with some good nuclei. That's another feature of this method, is that you tend to get reasonable nucleus staining because you are using hematoxylin. Certainly shouldn't be the main focus of your technique, but it's nice to get a little bit of extra detail there in morphology by virtue of seeing the nuclear details. So this has worked out quite well. There's actually some quite fine as well as more coarse bundles of elastin, which is great. So back to the same artery here, there's really nice staining of that internal elastic lamina and even some very fine fibres as well. So the literature tells us that generally the Verhoeff's technique, you can have difficulty being able to visualize both coarse and fine at the same time. So you tend to differentiate according to need, but that's actually turned out quite well. So now turning our attention back to the Orcein after 1 hour in the solution. The process for removing the stain is a little bit different to what we've seen for the Verhoeff's hematoxylin. We go straight to 70% alcohol to remove the bulk of the excess stain and then rinse off in water. Because of the tendency of the Orcein stain to bind via hydrogen bonding selectively, more so to the elastin fibres, you already tend to get a degree of preferential staining. There can, however, be some brownish staining of nuclei and collagen. So if necessary, we can give that longer in the alcohol later on. Okay, so just having a look now down the microscope, first thing we notice is that that's already a very nice contrast without much in the way of any sort of differentiation as such, just really rinsing off the excess. There's we've got some thicker bundles, the internal elastic lamina. Some of the red blood cells are retaining the stain too, that's interesting. But within the actual tissue elements, apart from red blood cells, we can see there's some fine elastin fibres within the connective tissue, and as well as those thicker bundles around those major arteries. So there's a bit of colour there to well, not so much the nuclei, but certainly collagen. So we can do a brief treatment with acid alcohol. I'm just using what would be a standard amount of treatment, say for a H&E, just as not to overdo it too much. And we'll just give that a check to see whether that's improved it. So it's improved it somewhat, I think. Again, you get a better look when we go to the higher power here. But that actually looks not too bad. I think that the brief treatment with acid alcohol has marginally reduced some of the staining within the collagen. And just now focusing on the elastin itself, I'm quite happy with the level of contrast that we've got. Maybe a little bit longer with alcohol might be able to reduce some of that background colour a little bit, but that's actually pretty good. It's one of those things that you can play around, and with experience or batch to batch variation, that's a nice little artery there too. 40x underwater is not particularly good, as you can see, but you can certainly get an idea of the level of staining there. So that's actually really nice, and I'm happy with that. Could possibly leave a little bit longer in the alcohol, but I might be able to make an adjustment later on for that. So now counter staining. There's several options. Most pathology laboratories, say for something like lung tissue, would do just a H&E, because that is ultimately the standard sort of morphological combination of stains. But I'm just going to use brief progressive staining with Mayer's hematoxylin, so 20 seconds, because I do find that it just gives a nice blue nuclear contrast to the brick red colour of the Orcein. So it's about 20 seconds for the first, and then by the time I get to the second, that'll be about 20 seconds as well. Rinsing that off. If you overdo the hematoxylin, then it does tend to make the collagen look a bit too blue, and I think it's better to keep that as clear as possible to contrast with the Orcein. Again, just the dilute ammonia to bring out the blue colour of the Mayer's hematoxylin. It's pretty much instant, but give it a bit of a shake to make sure it's evenly treated. Rinse that off in the water bath. And the same for the next one. Okay, and then we'll just give that a bit of a check as well, because I'm conscious of overdoing the Mayers, but 20 seconds is about right to begin with, or 15 to 20. Okay, so that looks okay. Now remember, this is looking through water rather than normally you'd have this cover slip with some plastic mounted. My feeling is that those nuclei are perhaps a little bit pale. Just gone out of focus here, but yeah, I'm tempted maybe to get rid of some of the background with a bit longer in alcohol, and before that it does look like it needs perhaps a bit more hematoxylin. So I think for one of those slides, I think I'll give that another 20 seconds, 15 to 20 seconds, just to see if that improves the overall nuclear staining. There's some very nice fine fibres there within the connective tissue next to that skeletal muscle, and just again through here. So yeah, I'm quite happy with the elastin stain itself. Again, there's that little artery there next to a smaller one. So yeah, that's pretty good. But I am thinking we could probably improve just a little bit. So let's just repeat that hematoxylin. Won't do it for both. We might just do it for one of them here, just so that we can have a look at the end and get an idea for try and get as close as possible to where we want to be. And just in case the other one looks better once it's cover slipped, we'll leave it as is. So again, about 15 to 20 seconds, and just rinse that off. And then again, we blew with the dilute ammonia. And then just rinse that off in the water. Now we could apply eosin, and in some laboratories there's good reason for doing that. They prefer to see some of the elastin overlaying what would be essentially a normal H&E. But just for seeing the elastin on its own, I find just the Mayer's hematoxylin is a nice combo. Okay, so from there we will dehydrate through the graded alcohols, and you notice I'm just leaving that first slide there in the 70%, and I'm going to sort of take a little bit of time here going through. Now if this was for a Van Giesen stain, obviously lingering too long in the alcohol is not a good thing, but I was just a little bit conscious that maybe the background was still just a little bit brown perhaps, and so just leaving the slides a little bit longer in the alcohol might just help to remove a bit more of the Orcein stain. Okay, but certainly making sure that we're rinsing the slide and rinsing the forceps at each change, and then through to the first xylene. So now here's actually the results. This is now mounted with the plastic mounting media, having taken both slides through to the second xylene. So this is just the 1 20-second treatment with hematoxylin. That actually looks pretty good. It certainly looks better than looking through water without a glass cover slip and plastic mounting media. So we've got nice demonstration of those brick red coloured elastin fibres. That's really quite nice. See, there's not much colour in those mucus glands there. So that all looks pretty good. Now you never want your counter stain to be overbearing, and so I think on that measure this nuclear counter stain is actually pretty good. And again, there's some beautiful elastin fibres there within the connective tissue, and a bit thicker bundle within a little arteriole. And just have a bit more of a look around here for that larger, it's probably a sort of a, might be a vein there potentially. Have to revise my structure of veins. It seems to have a little bit of elastic tissue in there, so there's a bit of a valve there and another vein. And some fine elastin fibres there. And there we go. There's our big sort of artery with the internal elastic lamina, and that looks really nice. So it turned out that the 20 seconds in the Mayer's hematoxylin was probably pretty close, and maybe 25 would be about right. Now we're going to the second slide. This had the extra time. Just starting now at low power. You can see within the epithelium there of the esophagus how slightly bluer that is. We'll just move this up to the high power just so the brightness is more correct. There we go. So now look, I think side by side there you get a nice comparison. So look, I think those are both great results. Orcein or Verhoeff's equally very good, and major differences there are just simply length of time and the final colour. So there it is.